While laughing with my friends, I told my husband he has a pathetic tool, but then the vibe shifted. I do not know exactly what I'll do to get my marriage back on the right track, and it's all my fault. I shouldn't have said what I said. In fact, I shouldn't have even cheated on my husband in the first place. I need your advice, guys. I think I have ruined my chances of getting back with my husband because, believe me, I've tried different means, but they're just not working, and I really need another alternative to work with. I cannot afford to lose Dan, really. Hello, Reddit. My name is Joanne. I'm 32 years old, and I've been married for 8 years now, but now I think I'm about to lose my marriage. Well, the thing that happened was that while laughing with my friends, I told my husband he has a pathetic tool, but then the vibe shifted. I honestly didn't know he'd take it that way, though. I honestly was just joking, and I actually just wanted the best for him, but he had taken it so seriously and had just tried to walk out. I went after him, and he had turned around and told me he wanted a divorce. When I tried to tell him I was only joking, he had ignored that and shouted at me right in front of my friends and our family, and had asked if it was because his tool was pathetic. That's why I felt it right to cheat on him. You see, I didn't exactly plan to cheat on my husband. I mean, I love him. That's why I married him. But I guess during the course of our marriage, I must have taken my husband for granted for too long. I met my husband Dan at an opening party that was hosted by my mother and organized by me to celebrate the opening of her new store. I had been so exhausted running around preparing for the perfect party for my mom because she did deserve it. My parents, especially my mom, had sacrificed quite a lot for us, her kids, and I felt she deserved every bit of the enjoyment she had. My sisters and I had built her a fashion mall knowing that my mom had always loved fashion. I mean, it showed really well in us, her children. She was always using us as experiments for new styles she had created in her head. I have 2 sisters, an elder one and a younger one. My younger sister, Madeline, was the one who followed in my mother's footsteps and became a fashionista. Caroline, my older sister, was always the serious career woman among us, and she had become a successful lawyer, while I had become an artist. At first, my parents had opposed my dreams because they felt artists usually ended up being junkies in the street, but all I wanted badly was just to paint and let people see the world through my paintings. My parents decided to give me 2 years to have a go at my dream, but under the condition that if I didn't hit it big, I was to go look for a job and do something else other than art. I had been so confident and had agreed, thinking that 2 years was a long time and I was going to get it. But I tried for the whole 2 years after college to sell some of my paintings to big and well-known museums. They refused because they wanted to buy paintings from well-known artists, and I was none of that. Eventually, I got tired of trying and had to get a job since I lost the bet with my parents. The job was actually quite interesting because I got a job as an editor, and soon enough, my dreams were just mild dreams, and I was hitting it big as an editor. So, my sisters and I, as I said earlier, decided to build a small store for my mother to achieve her lifelong dreams, as she no longer had to take care of us or sacrifice anything for us anymore. My mom had been so surprised and cried really hard the day we made the big reveal, so we eventually planned to have an opening party, and I was put in charge of making sure everything went fine as Caroline had a big case she had to prepare for, and Madeline was busy touring the world, but they both were to show up for the party. I hadn't known that setting up a party, however small, was that stressful, because some vendors delivering stuff would sometimes just cancel or have a delay or something, and I had to sort for another one. By the time it was for the party, I had been pretty exhausted and just wanted to run away. But it had all been worth it, as the radiant smiles on my mom's face just satisfied me greatly. So when the evening was coming to an end, I had tried to escape to the balcony to rest my aching feet from running around all day in high heels. Dan had apparently followed me and started to make small talk with me. He had apparently been invited by his aunt, whom he was staying with for his short visit, and his aunt was actually a friend of my mother's. He praised me for organizing the party, and I had relished the praise. We introduced ourselves and then spoke for a little while more before Madeline had come to call me back into the party to come take pictures with our parents, so I had excused myself. That night, I had found my thoughts wandering to Dan and thinking back to our conversation. I had regretted not collecting his contact, but I had hoped that I would maybe run into him another day, and that day came soon. The following week, while I had been running errands for the company I worked for, I had bumped into Dan and had been pleasantly surprised to see him. I couldn't wait around for small talk, but this time I ensured we exchanged contacts. We started talking from then on. We spoke a lot and got to find out more about each other. Dan is actually a woodworker. He had a way of looking at wood and knowing exactly what to build with it. He had amazing skill, and that, according to him, his parents had opposed bitterly to the line of work he chose, but he had been equally stubborn and went ahead with it anyway. It made me envy him because I had given up even before the 2 years deadline my parents gave me was up. Dan was literally an amazing guy who was able to multitask and get things done, even things that weren't exactly in his line of work, and I admired that very much about him. We started dating within a month of meeting, and within 6 months, Dan had asked me to marry him, and I had agreed. But my parents had opposed it slightly when I told them that Dan and I had decided to get married. They thought it was too early in our relationship to be getting married, but I had gotten really upset. And when Mom tried to talk to me afterward, I had asked how many months she dated my dad for, and that had kept her quiet about it. You see, my parents met each other and they had such strong chemistry, so within a week of meeting, they began dating and then got married within 2 months of dating. Mom had always told my siblings and me all about hers and Dad's love story. It was almost like a rhyme we could recite. I had always wanted the kind of love my parents had, and Dan gave me exactly that. He was almost like Dad, too. Stubborn, romantic, and spoke very few words. And they were also strong believers that actions spoke louder than words. My parents had no choice but to give in when I maintained my decision to marry Dan. Dan and I had gotten married in a local church my parents attended, and we had only friends and family around to witness our love. A year into our marriage, Dan had bought a house for us and had worked on some things alone and refused to let me see, saying it was a surprise. When it had been time for us to move in, Dan had taken me into one part of the house and called it my workspace. I had been surprised, thinking he meant it as a place where I could edit my work without having to stay late at the office trying to do just that, but I had seen the different brushes and materials, and I remember how happy I had been. Dan had told me that day that he wanted to support my dream, and that if I wanted to quit my job and chase after my dreams, even if it took years, he would be there to support me. And he was really there, like he had promised. I quit my day job and I started painting again. This time with a lot of confidence because I had the support I had always wanted from the beginning. I painted for another 2 years before I was recognized by a new museum in town. They were featuring the paintings of rookie artists, and I had presented my paintings, and they had bought it right away. I had been so happy, and when I told Dan about it, he had been so happy for me too. After the museum had bought one of my paintings, and it was featured, a lot of people loved it, and people started asking about the artist, and so I was given the opportunity to actually present most of my paintings in the museum, and that is how I got my fame in the art world. I started getting invited to parties, to award nights. I was even given 3 medals 2 years in a row as an uprising artist, and whose work was sold the highest. I was getting very recognized, and I loved the attention and fame, and I think I got too carried away by it. Soon enough, I started to ignore Dan. I could travel out of the country to go feature my work, and I wouldn't come back home for a week, weeks, and sometimes a month, whenever I had to go on a tour. At first, when I started traveling to showcase my works, I would beg my agents to let my husband come with me, but they would tell me then that my husband wasn't the star, I was, and taking him along would definitely make him feel inferior to me. I would feel bad and try talking to Dan about it, but he would dismiss it and say he would be back home waiting for me with my favorite food whenever I came back. It made me love him more back then. But we had our first fight when my agent decided that I needed a bigger workshop and that they wanted to build a workshop outside my home for me instead of the place Dan had built for it. They thought it bad for my reputation if I still worked in a small room already stocked with different artworks that I had been working on and hadn't finished. I had agreed with them and decided to tell Dan about it, but only after my new workshop was ready, and I only had to move in. Dan had been upset because I never informed him beforehand about the big decision I made, and that I regarded the place he had created for me as rubbish after I got my fame. I had been upset too and had lashed out. Back then, I thought he was just being jealous that I was making it big time, and I had told him exactly that. His response? I didn't exactly wait to hear it because I left the house that day and did not sleep at home. The next day, I came back with a moving truck to pick up my artworks. You know, the more painful thing I did that day was that I only picked up my artworks. All the brushes and materials that Dan had first bought me to work with, I left them. I had felt they were useless and outdated, that I could just get another one if I chose to. Dan apologized to me the next day when I still hadn't come home and had told me to come back home, and I did. But from then on, Dan said nothing about the workshop again, and stupid me was feeling happy that he finally got the memo. One time, my agent decided to throw me a party. The party was supposed to give people yet again a small feel of the newest works and have them anticipate them when they were finally done, so I was supposed to reveal 2 of my unfinished works and have people already bidding to buy them before they were out. It had been a great idea, but the party was a 1+1 party, and that meant I had to go with someone too, even though I was literally the host of the party. I had told Dan 2 days before the event, and he had been surprised because I was only telling him about it that late. I gave him silly excuses, bought him a suit and shoes, and also took him to a hair salon without listening to any of his protests about just having a haircut and having enough suits at home to choose from. The day of the party came, and I literally forgot about Dan and was having fun with my friends. Oh, by the way, I don't think I've mentioned them through the course of this story. My friends were Sonia and Biggie. Her real name is actually Tessa, but we called her that because she was rather on the big side, and we did call her that because she chose the nickname herself, so it wasn't meant to be a demeaning nickname or anything like that. They were my college friends, and we worked together when I worked as an editor, but even after I quit, we kept in touch and continued to be friends. When Sonia had eventually tapped me to go back to my husband, who was looking so out of place, I had looked over at the side of the room where he stayed and had just turned again to continue my discussion. Later during the party, Dan had walked up to me and told me he was retiring early for the night because he had some woodwork to deliver the next day.
No.
But I had gotten angry at him and was about to say that when one of my biggest clients walked over to me and started to talk about how excited he was for my next work. Then he looked over at Dan and had asked for an introduction, and I had introduced Dan as my husband, and my client had replied with an "oh," and without accepting Dan's handshake, he had continued telling me he wanted to get in the highest bid for my work when it was finished. When Dan slipped away beside me and away from the party, I didn't even know. I only noticed he was gone when the night had ended. When I got home that night, I had heard him working in the basement, and I had just taken a shower and slept off. The next morning, when I had woken up, Dan had gone out of the house, and he left me breakfast and a note to tell me he had to deliver work to a client, and wished me congratulations on the success of my party. After breakfast, I went out with my friends on a spa date. There they told me they did not like the way I had treated Dan at the party, and then they had also said Dan was obviously a good husband to me, and that I should make it up to him so I wouldn't lose him eventually, and I had dismissed their worries as nothing, and I had changed the topic. A few months after the party, I decided to buy a bigger and better house to suit my taste, and not only because of that. I was to be interviewed at my house and asked about how my dream started, and I felt like the house Dan bought was never going to suit my new fame. So, I had bought the house and only told Dan after I bought it. Dan had been so upset and had sworn that he was never going to move with me, and that I could suit myself if I wanted to live separately from my husband. Dan had never gotten that angry before, and also he never swore, so I knew he was stubbornly serious about his decision, and that upset me. So I had no choice but to put the house back on the market for sale and use the house we lived in for the interview. But then that interview went viral, and I became even more famous. Because I was asked about my first workshop, and I had shown them where I worked that my husband had built me, and they had asked why we never moved, and I had told them that I, of course, didn't want to upset my husband because it was his house we should definitely live in. That had gotten people's attention, and I was regarded as a loyal and humble wife who, despite her fame, was still in love with her husband and didn't want to make him feel inferior. Well, one part was true, and the other wasn't. I mean, I did love my husband, but I just wasn't the loyal and humble wife they spoke about. Another thing that went on online was the slandering of Dan's name. He was regarded as a bad husband who didn't want his wife to progress, and he was also pointed out for never having shown up at most of the parties I went to. So, it made it all the more reason that he was jealous of my achievements. If Dan saw anything about the interview and his sudden negative fame, he never said anything about it, and I also ignored it too, and I never corrected the public opinion about my husband. On our 7th anniversary, when Dan had planned a surprise for us to at least make up for the bumps and misunderstandings we've been having over the years, I wasn't there. I mean, it wasn't exactly my fault. I had promised Dan I would be there, and I had intended to be there, but 2 days prior to that day, I had been told by my agents that I had been invited to tutor some art students for 2 weeks on how to achieve better painting, and I was to be paid very handsomely. My agent had discussed the benefits of going, and they had been so tempting that I gave way. I traveled without telling Dan where I was going and skipped out on our 7th anniversary plans. When I got to the art college, I was introduced to their tutor and also the students. I tutored them for a week, but of course with the help of their tutor, Joel. Joel was actually fascinating to work with because of how much insight he had on art and how much of it he had to say. We spent a lot of time together, even after the daily lectures, and we would discuss, argue, and agree in some instances on things about art. Now it makes me wonder, with all his knowledge about art, why exactly he hadn't become famous. But then I was so stupid to think that it was just a luck thing. He showed me some of his work, and he had obviously seen most of my work online, so I taught him some basic styles to use while painting to achieve bolder and better paintings. He looked at me adoringly, and I loved the attention and the way he looked at me like I was the painting myself and not what I was drawing. He distracted me easily, and it made me uneasy. I was glad and disappointed when the 2 weeks finally ended, and I had to go back home. The night before I went back home, Joel had come to my hotel room with an offering of champagne to celebrate the end of a successful 2 weeks of tutoring. I had been so tempted, but then I refused. I didn't want to be alone with him in the room, especially because my sexual hormones were quite heightened that night, seeing that I was close to my menstrual flow. At times like that, I have always been with Dan, and he was the one always comforting me and holding me, and of course, having sex with me, and I guess I also took that for granted. But Joel had sounded so convincing that he just wanted to have a glass with me and then he would leave, just to celebrate and thank me for the opportunity to learn. I eventually accepted and allowed him in. That was the third biggest mistake of my life, and the second was actually allowing him to stay until midnight and finishing up the bottle of champagne instead of the 1 glass promised. And the first was actually having sex with him. He had leaned in and kissed me, and I hadn't even resisted, and we had ended up having sex. The next morning I woke up panicking, and Joel had, of course, apologized for the night and promised me that no one would find out about it, as it was also a one-time thing. I had relaxed, thinking I could trust him, but Joel was apparently a snake. After I had gone back home and tried to make it up to Dan for missing our anniversary, he had forgiven me, and we had moved past that. Then Dan had suggested we start to prepare for kids since we were getting older, and I had agreed. We started visiting fertility clinics to see if we were fertile enough to have kids. I remembered then that I was panicking when we first went to the hospital because I had had sex with Joel while I was ovulating, and I forgot to take the morning after pill because I was rushing to get to the airport and away from the sin I had just committed. But I knew refusing to go with my husband to the fertility clinic would upset him, and I didn't want that. I guess it was kind of my way of making up to him for sleeping with someone else and cheating on our marriage, even though he obviously didn't know that. We were tested and were both healthy, and I confirmed secretly that I wasn't carrying any baby. I was so relieved because that would have made everything so complicated. I was happy that that meant I got to live the life I lived without fear. But well, I guess life had other plans, or should I say, the life called Joel had other plans. 2 months later, Joel showed up at my workshop, and he told me he was on a month's leave and wanted to come see me because he missed me. I panicked and started to think of ways to get rid of him, but Joel didn't make that easy for me. He kept showing up at my workshop, and one time he even showed up at my home. Luckily, Dan hadn't been around as he had gone to get some woodwork delivered to his clients. Joel kissed me, and when I resisted, he continued until he had me compliant. We had sex right there in my husband's home, right on our couch. After the sex, Joel grinned satisfactorily and left, leaving me feeling like shit. I sat on that couch for probably hours, thinking about my actions, and it wasn't until I heard Dan drive in that I quickly put on my clothes and rearranged the cushion pillows that were discarded carelessly in our rushed attempts to get each other naked. I quickly went into the shower to get rid of Joel's scent on me, and I threw my clothes into the washing machine. Dan had been surprised because he knew I hardly took 2 showers unless I had gone out, but he knew I was home all day, so he asked, and I lied that I just felt icky and decided to shower again. Dan believed me, of course, and went to the kitchen to plate the food he bought us. I felt so guilty after the second time Joel and I had sex, and I knew I was going to get into trouble soon if I did not end things with him. Believe me, I tried verbally to end things with Joel, but it felt like my body had a mind of its own and was only ever activated when Joel touched me. I kept sleeping with Joel, and this time it was at my workshop, not at my house. I made sure he understood the rule never to come to my house again, and he did follow that rule. A month passed, and Joel still didn't go back. Whenever I asked, he'd silence me with a kiss or sex. So eventually I stopped asking. This went on for almost 3 months, until all of a sudden Joel just disappeared. I was worried at first, and visited his rented apartment when he didn't show up as we had planned that day, but I was told by his co-tenants that he just suddenly packed up and left in a hurry, in fact. I was shocked. I tried texting and calling him, but his number was unreachable. This continued for 2 more weeks, and I decided to call his workplace to ask about him. It was then I found out that Joel had actually been fired 3 months back because he had been found stealing artworks from the school and selling them on the black market. I was so shocked, and it was like my brain was finally functioning properly when I went into my art studio and found about 4 pieces of my artworks missing. I didn't know what to do because I could not make a report given our affair, and because I had actually given him a key so he could wait around for me whenever I wasn't there. Those artworks had already been bought and were there for delivery the next week, so I had to start painting again. I worked tirelessly, day and night, to paint all 4 of them before I had to deliver them. I knew they didn't exactly look the same as the original, but I had no choice, so I had them delivered to the owners. So, 2 more months passed, and there was no storm as I had expected, and my buyers loved the painting. Well, of course, they did not know about the originals. Dan and I were still trying for a baby, but what he didn't know was that I was actually the one preventing a baby because while I was sleeping with him and Joel, I had to protect myself against getting pregnant because I didn't want confusion as regards the father of the baby. So, when Joel left, I stopped taking the drugs, but it was still difficult to get pregnant, and I was getting frustrated. One time, Dan started to behave very oddly, and he spent more time outside than he did with me, and that was unusual. At first, I thought it was because of work, but then he hadn't been working in the basement for a while, and when Dan eventually came home, he would be too drunk to hold any conversations with. I became very worried because I couldn't understand why he was behaving like that. The day everything changed from good straight to the worst was that day. That day, I wish I had known about it beforehand, so I could have avoided it. That day, Sonia and Biggie had come to visit me because apparently it had been a while since I went over to their place, given that I had first been busy with Joel, and later was worried about Dan's change in attitude. So, when my friends had decided to come over, I had told Dan before he had wanted to leave the house so he could come back early enough to say hi to them and also eat lunch, and he had just shrugged and left. So when they did arrive, we talked about a lot of stuff, and we fed each other details about our lives that we had missed out on, and of course I removed the parts about Joel. That same morning, my family decided to spring up a surprise visit on me. It had been so long since I visited home because of my work, even though we lived in the same city, and it was only a 2-hour drive to get to my parents' home. I had been so happy to see my parents, and especially my sisters, and of course they knew Sonia and Biggie, so they also exchanged pleasantries, and I had to dash out and get more groceries to cook for everyone. Dan arrived just in time for lunch, and when I had gone to greet him, he had responded tartly, and I guess that everybody noticed, and they kept quiet and started eating. It was awkward for a while until Madeline had started to tell everyone about her last trip, and then everywhere had been filled with laughter at her stories, and everything went back to normal except my husband wasn't exactly laughing. Mom asked about how my work was going, and I told her, and my friends were telling the family that I was just trying to be humble by only giving them bits and pieces, and they had started teasing me and calling me a celebrity. I had laughed and joked along with them, and my mom had turned to Dan and touched his hand affectionately, asking about his work too, and he had just replied with a fine, and because I had noticed the awkwardness starting up again, I had started teasing him while my friends were also supporting me. I was telling them that despite his small, pathetic old tools, he still put them to good work and had some clients, and that he was working on acquiring bigger and better ones to work with. I know that Dan prided himself on his tools that he had first bought with his hard-earned money, and that he had never discussed purchasing any new tools with me. But I just wanted to impress everyone, and I guess that backfired very badly. Dan's mood had changed instantly, and he had dropped his spoon with a loud bang and muttered an "excuse me" before leaving. I knew I had said the wrong thing, and I tried to go after him to apologize, but Dan had turned sharply and shouted at me right there in front of everyone. He had asked me if it was because of his pathetic tools or his non-famous status that made me think it right to cheat on him for months and rub the affair under his nose. I had been so shocked that Dan actually found out about my affair, and I hadn't even said anything to defend myself until he had looked at me as if disgusted by what he saw and told me that our marriage was over. I had started crying and begging him, but he wouldn't even listen, and he just left. After he did, so did my family and friends without uttering a single word to me. It's been 3 hard days of my life, and neither Dan nor my family and friends are speaking to me. Please, guys, I really cannot lose Dan. Please, what do I do? How do I get back my marriage? Update. Hello, Reddit. It's been the hardest 3 months of my life. I'm so drowning, and it's in the pool of my own sin. I've ruined both my life and my marriage altogether, and I feel so awful. I think that heartbreak is smaller compared to the feelings I have right now. My heart feels so heavy. It's like a crushing weight in my chest. No one is speaking to me, and it seems now that everywhere, both online and physically, everyone is condemning me. About my paintings that Joel stole, he was found out and arrested and has been in prison ever since, but not without him confessing and trying to lie that I gave those paintings to him because we were lovers, and I had no choice but to confess that he did steal them from me, but only had access to them in the first place because we were involved. Now my cheating story is out there on every platform, and I'm being vandalized everywhere. Even most of my clients returned the paintings they bought from me and requested a refund, which left me very broke. I mean, I had to sell my workshop and some of the paintings in black markets for very, very cheap prices just to pay off the debts I had. Now I'm very lonely, broken, and without Dan. I don't know what I was really thinking when I decided that the best way to repay Dan's love and kindness was by cheating and also treating him like he was worthless beside my achievements. The so-called achievements are now nothing. All rubbish. I have nothing to me. No husband, no supporting family, no friends, no career. All I do now is cry myself to sleep and wonder how I could have been so stupid as to let things be the way they are. I don't even know what to do with my life anymore. Suddenly, I have no dreams, no hope for what's coming next. The present weighs me down so badly that I dare not hope for the future. The one person that stood by me and believed in me when I was nothing now has left me alone because of my own stupid actions. I cheated on my husband with a liar and a thief who has now ruined everything I've ever worked for. I don't even blame him at all. Had I been wise enough to see through his actions, I wouldn't be in this mess I brought upon myself. All I do now, every day, is cry myself to sleep. I have nothing else to do and no one to go to. It hurts to be me right now. I know you all think I deserve what I got, and honestly, I think so too. I know that Dan will never forgive me for what I did to him, and honestly, if I were him, I wouldn't forgive me either. I really desperately wish that things were different. Maybe now I'd still be famous, positively in the art world, and I may probably be pregnant by now with Dan's baby, and knowing Dan, I know he'd make an amazing father. But that's what everything is now. A wish that can never be real. Update. Hello Reddit, this is my very last post here, and I just have 2 things to say. One would be, don't ever be like me because I can tell you how painful it is being me right now. And 2 would still be, please don't even attempt being like me. Thanks and goodbye.